Hey everyone, really quick before the story begins, I would like to give a huge thank you to Verastahl for allowing me to share this story. He is an incredibly talented author, and has recently released a book called The Outsiders Book 1, which you can find on Amazon. If any of you are interested in reading some more of his work after hearing this story, you can find a link to that as well as his website in the description. With that being said, I hope you all enjoy the video, and I hope you all have a great night. When I was growing up, I lived in a small town called Coventry. We moved away when I was 15, but I always considered Coventry to be my hometown, and Mike Mattis was always my best friend. We moved to another state, so I only saw Mike a couple of times between the move and college. But we always stayed in touch, and even wound up going to the same college the last 2 years, when Mike transferred in from a junior college near Coventry. After college, I went on to graduate school at Texas A&M for architectural design, and Mike went back to Coventry where he started teaching at the local high school. Life went on, and we drifted apart some over the years. But when I got married, he was my best man. When we had our first child 2 years later, he was in the waiting room with me. We were best friends for life, regardless of how often we talked. Maybe that's why it didn't seem strange when I stopped hearing from him for several months. Our communications had never been very regular. A text every few weeks, a phone call every couple of months, that kind of thing. And we tried to get together when we could, but in the 2 years since having our little girl, travel plans had slid to the back burner. One day I was sitting in a meeting with a potential client, listening to him try to convince us that it should be possible for us to design his shopping center to be both a palatial shrine to wealth and comfort, while still being buildable on a dismally low budget. I was about to tell him for the 10th time that he needed to get with his contractor to talk about the build costs when I heard my phone buzz. I picked it up and saw it was a text from Mike. Up for coming back to Coventry for a long weekend? I didn't respond right away, but the more I thought about it throughout the day and on the way home, the more appealing the idea became. It occurred to me that I hadn't actually been back to Coventry since we moved away over 14 years ago. More importantly, looking back through my call and text logs, I realized it had nearly been 4 months since I had talked to Mike. Feeling a stab of guilt and nostalgia, I talked to my wife Stacy about it, and she was all for it. She'd stay back and take care of our little girl, and I talked to Mike about going and staying 2 or 3 days when it was good for him. When I called Mike's phone, no one answered, and it said that the voicemail box had not yet been set up. I was going to wait and call again later in the evening, but then my phone lit up with a return call from Mike.
Hey Parker, sorry I missed your call, man.
No problem, just wanted to call after getting your text. How have you been doing?
Good, real good. Things have been going real good here. Hey, you up for coming back to Coventry for a long weekend?
Mike's voice was slightly strange, almost like he was distracted or stressed out about something, and his question struck me as oddly awkward, mimicking the text message word for word, and sounding almost like he was reading from a telemarketer's script, and was new at the job. It was the opposite of the way he normally was. If anything, Mike normally took things too easy, and I had never known him to be awkward talking to anyone, let alone me. Still, it had been a few months, and maybe he had something going on. I suddenly worried I'd caught him at a bad time. Hey, yeah, I am, but can we do it later if things are too busy right now? It's up to you. I was barely done with the last word before he was talking again, his tone more strident.
No, you should come right away.
He paused and let out an uneven laugh. When he started back, he sounded like he was forcing himself to be slower and calmer, more laid back sounding.
It's all good, man. I miss seeing you. I'd like to show you around the town some, too. A lot has changed since you were here.
Deciding I was overthinking it, I pushed on. Cool, man. How's next weekend sound? I could fly in Friday morning and fly out Sunday night. If you want to pick me up at the Glenville airport, that's cool. If not, I can rent a car. What do you think?
Sounds great. Just send me the flight information and I'll pick you up.
When I got off the phone, I told Stacy about the weirdness of the conversation, but she agreed that he was probably just preoccupied or just woke up or something else innocuous. He was my best friend and I should go see him, and it would be cool to see how the town has changed. She had never seen my hometown, so she made me promise to take lots of pictures. An hour later, I had booked a flight for the following Friday morning. The Glenville airport was tiny and dingy, consisting of a single brown brick hallway with a rental car kiosk and metal detectors on one end and the waiting area for the single terminal on the other. The small connecting flight had consisted of me and only a handful of other travelers, so there weren't but a couple of people waiting for the plane's arrival when I entered the building. Still, it took me a few seconds to recognize Mike. As I said, I hadn't seen him since my daughter's birth 2 years earlier. But in that time, he must have lost close to 100 pounds, about 70 of which he didn't have to spare. He looked gaunt and sickly, and while I tried to not let it show in my expression, as I hugged his bony frame, I felt a caustic mixture of fear and guilt curdling in my chest. My first thought was cancer or some immune disease. Clearly, something was wrong. I had intended on waiting and broaching the topic more tactfully, but when I pulled back and saw his pale blue eyes in their dark and sunken sockets, watched his thin, cracked lips stretched over teeth that seemed too big in his now gaunt face, it just spilled out. Fuck, man, are you sick? You've lost a ton of weight. I could hear the worry in my own voice, but there was some accusation and anger too. Why hadn't he told me he was going through all this? I could have helped, or at least talked to him more. He was already shaking his head though, a deep laugh in his too pale throat. No, Park, nothing like that. I have lost a lot of weight, that's true. At first I was doing it on purpose. I was running a lot, trying to build up to do marathons. Then I got hit with this weird gastro thing for a while. It fucked me up for about 6 weeks, and I only got over it last month. I'd already lost about 30 pounds before I got sick, and I dropped another 40 eating broth and crackers for so long. I know I still look like shit, but I'm on the mend. Just got checked last week and the doc said I've gained back 12 pounds so far. Trying to do it slow and steady, the healthy way. I frowned, not sure I believed him, but desperately hoping that it was true, and I worried I'd hurt his feelings. Look, you don't look like shit. You're just really skinny and it scared me for a second. If you say you're over it though, that's great. I was just worried. Mike laughed again and gave me a slight shove. I appreciate it, man. I'm so glad you're here. We headed out to his car, the same beat-up SUV he'd had since he crashed his old car the last year of college, and headed out of town towards Coventry. He asked me a few questions about Stacy and the baby, and there were times during the drive that he almost seemed like his old self. But then he would suddenly trail off and go silent in the middle of asking a question, or telling a story like a weak radio signal fading out as you drive along. Then right when I'd been on the edge of asking if something was wrong, he'd pick back up with something else, talking about the little shits in the classes he taught or how he was ready to be living on his own again. He warned me that we were going to his parents' house to stay, as he had been staying there since he was so sick and all his stuff was still there. He looked slightly embarrassed, but I told him I remembered that his mom was a great cook, and I knew he couldn't cook for shit, so it was an upgrade. He laughed and shrugged. We'll see what you think of her cooking now. We're all on kind of a health food kick since I got so sick. All organic stuff. No meat, no gluten. You get used to it. But it might be a bit of a shock to your system. I grinned, looking out at the countryside as we rode along. It really was good to be back. The country out here was beautiful, and I had a lot of good memories from growing up around here. I'm sure I'll manage. So what do you want to do while I'm out here? I'm up for whatever, or just hanging out with you, eating kale. Mike snickered and glanced at me. Suddenly his face grew inexplicably sad. You really are a good guy, Parker. A good friend. My best friend. I frowned. Yeah, man, of course. You're my best friend too. Are you sure you're okay? You can tell me if something else is going on. He just looked at me for several moments, his expression still stricken, his lips moving wordlessly as though caught between a whisper and a sigh. Then his eyes cut away and back to the road. And when he spoke, his voice sounded strange again, like it had been on the phone. No, everything is fine. Just glad you could come. We drove on in silence for several minutes, and I could see Mike's hands flexing as he clenched the steering wheel. Finally, his grip relaxed, and when he spoke next, it was in a more conversational tone. So, about things to do. I can show you around the town, of course. A lot has changed since you were last here. It's grown some, though it's still small compared to something like Glenville. We can go bowling at the new alley that opened up a few years ago. It's a nice place and they have a tendency to hire hot college girls to work the counters. I snorted. Aren't you getting a bit old for trolling the college girls at a bowling alley? He shrugged. Coventry doesn't have the largest dating pool, and while I admit this is a bit hypocritical since I live there myself, I find that women my age around here, that aren't already married at least, tend to not be awesome. At least with the college girls, there's a hope I could find a girl who is intelligent and ambitious enough to still get out there while the getting's good. Laughing, I shoved him on the arm. Oh, so you're going to find some hard-working girl with a bright future and ride her coattails out of town? He started to respond and then stopped, his expression darkening. No, that's a nice idea, but no, man. I'll never go anywhere else. I'm going to die right here in Coventry. I didn't know what to say. I was still trying to come up with something that could be encouraging without sounding patronizing when his expression smoothed, and he glanced at me again. One thing you have to do while you're here is go see the new tunnel. I raised an eyebrow. The new tunnel? What new tunnel? His lips stretched back in a strange smile. Oh, it's really something. Out on the north side of town where they used to have the big horse ranch. It's grown up out there a lot more now. They're even putting in a new Walmart close by. But that tunnel, well, you just have to wait and see. I was going to ask more questions, but I realized we were slowing to a stop. Looking up, I saw why. We were at his parents' house. Mike's parents lived in an old ranch-style house. They'd lived there since I was 12, and I remember always being amazed at how clean and well kept up it always was. Not that my family's houses growing up were terrible, but between Mr. Mattis keeping up the yard and the exterior, and Mrs. Mattis keeping the inside immaculate, I always felt like I was walking into an idealized version of what a family home should be. This extended to Mike's parents themselves. His father was a kind-hearted man who ran a local hunting supply store, and was always quick with a funny story or joke. His mother had been like a second mom to me growing up. She ran her own accounting firm and was always running around, but she was also one of the few adults that seemed to actually care about what was going on in Mike's life, and my own beyond the normal cursory check that we weren't being abducted or hooked on drugs. Seeing the house now was almost as big of a shock as seeing Mike himself. More than one shutter was partially fallen down, and a ragged blue tarp was draped like a sash around the chimney, presumably to try and stop a leak. The yard was a thick mess of weeds, and as we entered the house, the sense of clutter and disuse only multiplied. It wasn't filthy, and I understood that people sometimes let their housekeeping slide as they get older, but it was such a sharp contrast from what I remembered. Mike led me down the hall to the guest bedroom so I could put my stuff down. And as we passed the kitchen, I saw his parents from behind. They were standing side by side, still and silent as statues, staring at the faded floral wallpaper on the far kitchen wall. I was going to say something, but there was something so unnatural about what I was seeing that an inner voice or instinct warned against it, and I wound up just moving on down the hall to where Mike was waiting. After I put my stuff down in the guest room, I asked if we should stick around for a bit so I could say hi to his parents. Mike seemed to ponder it momentarily and then shrugged. Nah, let's just catch up with them tonight. We can grab lunch and then go goof off for a while. I think Mom's planning on fixing a big dinner for us anyway. I nodded and followed him back out, stealing a glance back into the kitchen as we passed. There was no one there now, and we saw no signs of his parents as we went outside and got in his SUV. I was still uneasy about how strangely they had been standing in the kitchen, and how Mike was acting, but I tried to set it aside, deciding that I would chalk it up to an overactive imagination, unless something else strange popped up. The afternoon was actually pretty good. Mike took me by his high school and showed me his classroom. School was out for the summer and all of the rooms were in disarray, from the custodians re-waxing all the floors. But it was nice to see a part of Mike's life that was relatively normal. It was weird to think of him as a grown-up with a grown-up job, but he seemed to like it despite all his complaining, and I had no doubt he was a good teacher. We then went to get something to eat, but the first two restaurants were closed despite it being early in the afternoon. We ultimately settled for a fast food drive-thru before heading to the bowling alley. The bowling alley wasn't in as good of shape as I had expected, based on what Mike had said. But then the same could be said for much of Coventry. It was strange. Portions of towns would be in relatively good repair, while others seemed to be entering a sharp decline. This can happen in any town, of course, but what was odd was how it was happening here. There was no rhyme or reason to it, with a well-kept building side by side with those headed towards ruination. There was no nice or not nice part of town, so far as I could see. There was still smaller houses in poorer neighborhoods, and larger ones in wealthier areas, but the neglect and air of disuse was spread equally among everyone. When I mentioned it to Mike as we were getting out at the bowling alley, he just shrugged and laughed. Yeah, property values and stuff have been all over the place lately. I think it'll get better with some time, though. I think that new tunnel is going to help things a lot in the long run. I almost stopped walking and forced him to tell me about the tunnel. I should have. But I was enjoying being back around him, and it seemed like it was doing him a lot of good too. So I just smiled and nodded, pushing my worry down as we entered the bowling alley. The place was relatively clean inside, though it was dimly lit in spots due to overhead lights that had gone out and not been replaced. Mike led me up to the counter where a young woman was staring at us. The girl probably was of college age, but it was hard to say for sure due to her appearance. Her curly brown hair hung in damp, tangled strings down the side of her long, pale face. Her skin had an unhealthy, waxy quality to it, and the glazed look in her eyes made me think she was either high or suffering from a substantial fever. The worst part was that she had these clusters of pus-filled sores, festooning the skin around both nostrils. I had to fight from reacting as we approached. And when Mike asked for shoes, I echoed him dimly with my own size, while trying to avoid looking at her farther without being obvious. It didn't stop me from noticing that one of the sores was starting to drip down onto her lips, as she handed me my pair. When we were away from her and at lane 12 putting on our shoes, I whispered to him, "What is wrong with her? That's not acne." Mike glanced toward the front counter and then at me. "Yeah, she's sick with something. I don't know. That kind of thing has been going around lately. Luckily, my stomach problems didn't include killer pimples." He tried to smile, but it faltered. "I do feel bad for her, though. Poor kid." Glancing around at the empty lanes, he let out a sigh. I guess Friday afternoon is not the beehive of activity I was hoping for. Still, when's the last time you had a nice quiet bowling alley all to yourself? Dinner was surprisingly normal until the end. Mike's parents were older and a little odd, but more in the normal way you expect people to get in the last third of their life. They would talk over each other, repeat themselves occasionally, and take turns pelting me with questions about my life. It was kind of sweet, and it filled me with a sense of profound relief to just laugh and talk with these people that used to be a big part of my life, without any of the disquieting strangeness I'd been seeing lately. The meal itself was not great, but it certainly seemed healthy. Grilled artichokes and steamed kale, along with a small cold salad that seemed to be a mixture of tomatoes, cucumbers, and some odd vegetable I couldn't identify. I took a bite of it and my mouth was filled with a pungent, smoky-tasting liquid that I assumed came from the inside of the vegetable. Grimacing, I caught myself before I swallowed and spat it out into my napkin. I didn't know what that was, but I didn't want any. I could even feel a light tingling numbness on my tongue and lips from it. After we had finished eating and the conversation was starting to die down, Mike's dad asked me what we were going to do the next day. I shrugged and said I was up for whatever, with Mike adding in that he was thinking about taking me to the old state park west of town to go hiking in the morning. I remembered us camping out there with Mike's dad when we were 12 or so, and I was already nodding enthusiastically at the idea of visiting it again. Mike's father smiled thinly as he looked at Mike. That sounds just fine. Make sure you take him to see the tunnel. It's really something. His gaze shifted to me. You really won't believe it. At this point, I'd had enough. Okay, what is this tunnel about? Mike keeps talking about it, now you are too. Is it some kind of practical joke? Is there really a tunnel north of town? Mike was looking nervous, possibly even scared, as he responded, his eyes going between me and his father. No, it's there, and it is very interesting, but we can talk more about it later. Looking back at me, he added, It's not a big deal and we don't have to see it if you don't want to. I saw his father staring at Mike out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face him while talking to Mike, catching the older man's gaze again. No, Mike, I'm fine to see it, but what is it? Why do we have a tunnel around here anyway? Most of the land around here is flat. Did we suddenly grow a mountain I'm not aware of? Mike's father just stared at me silently, his expression stony. When Mike didn't respond, I addressed his father. What about you, Mr. Mattis? Can you tell me why there's a tunnel here and what's so great about it? The man's lips stretched tight across his face, slowly slipping back to reveal his gray, receding gums and his long, yellowed teeth. It looked less like a smile and more like a rabid dog baring his teeth. He looked at me steadily, and I could see a trace of yellow around his irises that matched his mouth. He clicked his tongue together once, twice, and then turned his poached egg eyes back to Mike. He'll understand better when he sees it, son. You make sure he sees it tomorrow. With that, he stood up and tapped Mike's mother on the shoulder where she was standing at the sink. Without another word, they both left the kitchen and moved out of sight down the hall. When I felt they were likely out of earshot, I looked back at Mike. What the fuck was all that? He looked uncomfortable. You know how it is. People get weird when they get older. The tunnel is just something that got made a few months back, and it was a big deal at the time. Part of some new road development or something maybe. But everyone thought it was great at the time, and some people still do. Small towns fixate on anything new, I guess. What he was saying made no sense, but he looked so desperate for me to believe him. For the conversation to be over, I just nodded. Okay, man, well, I think I'm going to get some rest if that's okay with you. I'm kinda beat. He nodded, and I stood up to leave the kitchen when he caught my arm. If you don't feel right about things, if you aren't comfortable here, it's okay for you to go. I mean, I would understand if you wanted to. Right now, even. His expression was sad and he was having trouble meeting my eyes, but as he said the last of it, he looked at me clearly. If you want to go, right now is a good time. I considered it seriously. I didn't know what was going on, and I was feeling more and more like I was in the first act of a horror movie. But that was stupid. Things like that didn't happen in real life. There was nothing sinister going on in this town. It was just a rundown little community whose best days were probably behind it. It was just my best friend who had been sick, was lonely, and who felt trapped in the place he had never really left. My best friend who had finally worked up the courage to reach out to me. I wasn't going to abandon him, just because I was a little uncomfortable and weirded out. Shaking my head, I patted his shoulder. "Nah, man, I'm cool. Just really tired. Let me get a good night's sleep and I'll be raring to go tomorrow. I promise." He nodded, the sad look still on his face. "Okay, Park. Okay." I gave his shoulder another pat and headed back to the guest room. I heard movement from the other room that I assumed was his parents' bedroom, but I quickly ducked into my room out of fear that one or both of them were coming back out. I wanted to avoid another run-in for a bit. Laying down on the bed, I realized I was really exhausted. Without even changing my clothes or turning out the lights, I soon found myself fast asleep. I woke up to rough hands carrying me by shoulders and legs through the still warm night air. I was disoriented at first, in part because when I looked up, I saw Mike's parents and two other people that I didn't recognize were carrying me somewhere. Behind them and between passing streetlights, I could see the blackness of the summer sky, and looking around, I was being carried up a street in the part of town I didn't recognize. I wanted to struggle, but I was coming to realize that I had somehow been drugged. Every attempt to move my limbs felt like I was fighting against quickly drying cement. I heard Mike's voice a few feet back from the direction we were going. "Fuck, he's waking up. You said he wouldn't wake up before it was over." One of the men I didn't recognize glared back in Mike's direction. "He has to be awake to appreciate it, doesn't he? He has to look to truly see it and understand." That's when we began to cross the threshold into the tunnel. We were moving at a distinctly downward angle now, and the air was growing cooler as they walked. Looking at the walls of the tunnel and the fading lights, I saw no signs of concrete or wood. Instead, every angle of the tunnel seemed to be made of packed earth, held together by clusters of ebony nodules, and gray tendons rippling and twisting through the earth, and connecting one group of black barnacle-like protrusions to the next. I redoubled my efforts to move, and while I managed to pull my arm free from Mike's mother's grip for a moment, she quickly regained control. I cast my eyes around for any other avenue of escape. That's when I saw the stomach of the man who had yelled at Mike. His shirt was ridden up and toting me, and I could see what kind of looked like a handprint on his lower stomach. Except the handprint was abnormally long and narrow, with what seemed to be 6 distinct and spindly fingers. And the print wasn't just some stain or even a burn. It was made up of the same fetid, blossoming sores that had been clustered around that poor girl's nose. I began to scream then, and a moment later I was on the ground. At first I thought I was being dropped intentionally, but then I saw Mike had shoved down Handprint Man, and then done the same to his father. I understood he was trying to help me, but there was only one of him and I couldn't fight. The thunder of gunfire echoed in the tunnel, and the muzzle flash lit up the darkness enough for me to see something moving towards us from farther within the void. I don't remember what it looked like now, or how we even got out of the tunnel. All I remember is Mike helping me into the driver's seat of his SUV and pressing the keys into my hand. He was sobbing, and his left arm flopped uselessly by his side. He told me I had to go. I had to drive as best I could and get away. Drive back down away from the tunnel. Keep going south until I hit a state highway, and then pick up a direction. keep going until I got to a bus station or an airport. I was more lucid now and interrupted him. "No, you need to come with me. I'm not leaving you here." He shook his head. "I told you, I can't leave here." He reached out and grabbed the sides of my face. "Park, you listen to me. You need to get away now and never come back. I may call or text you, but you never answer, and you never come back." I didn't fully understand, but I'm ashamed to say I didn't argue farther. Whatever shadowy recollection I had of what was in that tunnel was more powerful than my love for my best friend. I drove away and made it to the bus station, then an airport. Mike must have been at least considering this plan for a while, because I found my wallet in the glove compartment of his car, a new photograph tucked in with my cash. I made it home eventually, and after some time just holding Stacy and our little girl, I told her what happened, warned her that we could never go back near that place or those people again, including Mike. I don't know that she fully believed me, but she agreed. Then we heard the phone buzz. She picked it up off the counter and I saw her face pale. When she showed it to me, I saw it was a new text from Mike. "Up for coming back to Coventry for a long weekend?" I took the phone out to the garage and hammered it apart, changed the number and got a new phone the next day. Less than a week later, it buzzed with a new message from Mike. "Up for coming back to Coventry for a long weekend?" We've decided to move now. I'm writing this from a hotel room we're staying in until our new house is ready. The third phone, a burner, hasn't been tracked down yet, so hopefully we're in the clear. Still, I wanted there to be some record of all this. I'm holding the photo Mike had put in my wallet, and I'm trying not to wake Stacy with my crying. The picture is one Mike's mother took of us when we were 14. We were getting ready for trick-or-treating, despite Mike's father subtly hinting we were too old for it. I think we both knew he was right, but we also knew this was one of the few childhood things we had left. Besides, a week or two earlier, my father had gotten notice that the local plant he worked in was closing, which meant we were likely moving to another state in the next few months, so we were going to make the most of the time we had left. I look at that picture, reminded of all the memories and emotions I still have from my childhood, and my friendship with Mike, and then I think about the last time I saw him in the rear view of his car, standing on a lonely road, broken and terrified, and so hopeless as he watches me go, watches me leave him one last time. As I started around the corner that took him out of view, I think he was turning to limp back to the tunnel. "I loved you, Mike. I'm so sorry."